Tonight, Nightmare Narrative presents Nightmare Now, as we journey through space and time to uncover the monsters, the strange, the extraterrestrial, the paranormal, and the mind-boggling mysteries of the universe. So sit back, relax, and be scared on this episode of Nightmare Now, Ghosts in the Bible. Hey guys, Will here. This video will kind of be a sermon, so get comfortable and open your mind a little bit. This video is 100% inspired by Pastor Chase Thompson's book, Angels, Ghosts, and Other Bible Mysteries. I will be reading mostly passages from this book. Ghosts can't possibly be real according to the Bible, can they? I mean, as a Christian, it just seems irresponsible to discuss such a thing as ghosts. And yet, we do find ghosts, or something like ghosts, mentioned in the Bible. And it's very clear that many early church fathers, like Augustine, Luther, Wesley, they all discuss ghosts in a sober and mostly serious manner. So let's lead off by discussing the curious incident of the Witch of Endor, as recounted in 1 Samuel chapter 28. To give you some backstory, prior to the establishment of monarchy in Israel, the country was led by a series of divinely inspired leaders called judges, whom God would raise up from time to time to rescue the people from disaster or lead them into spiritual revival. The last major judge of Israel was a priest named Samuel, who was a righteous man and a devout follower of Yahweh, or the God of the Bible. During Samuel's time of leadership, the people of Israel began to notice nearby nations were not led by judges or by God, but by powerful and charismatic kings, so they demanded a king for themselves. Samuel advised against it, but the will of the people prevailed, and Saul was chosen to be the first king of Israel. Saul was most likely not chosen so much for his wisdom or his devoutness, but because he looked the part. He was tall and manly and regal, and the people were quite proud to have him as a king. Initially, Samuel mentored Saul and sought to teach him to be a wise and good king, and Saul listened well. Unfortunately, as Samuel got older, Saul grew less dependent on his counsel and more dependent on his own strength and might. Ultimately, this led to Saul rejecting several important commands of God, and God himself rejecting the kingship of Saul. God commanded Samuel to go and anoint a successor to King Saul, the young shepherd boy David, who would become one of the greatest leaders of Israel's history. Shortly after anointing David as king, Samuel died and left King Saul without a godly and wise advisor. The distance between God and Saul grew by the day, and ultimately, Saul found himself in a desperate situation that he had no idea how to handle, and neither did his counselors. Saul decided to handle this problem by consulting with Samuel, his trusted mentor and advisor. There were two problems with this course of action, though. Number one, Samuel was dead. Number two, Saul himself had enacted laws in Israel that made it a capital crime to seek to communicate with the dead. Thus, Saul was in a tough situation. Do not turn to mediums or consult spiritists, or you will be defiled by them. I am Yahweh, your God. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 31. Whoever turns to mediums or spiritists and prostitutes himself with them, I will turn against that person and cut him off from his people. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 6. No one among you is to make his son or daughter pass through the fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, or practice sorcery, cast spells, consult a medium, or a familiar spirit, or inquire of the dead. Everyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, and the Lord your God is driving out the nations before you because of these detestable things. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 10 through 12.
The Old Testament is quite clear that it is absolutely dangerous and forbidden for followers of God to seek to talk to the dead through mediums, as evidenced by these passages. There are other passages also that decry the dangers of consulting with the dead. Reading between the lines, one doesn't get the idea that this was outlawed by God because it was fraudulent or not real, but because seeking to speak to the dead was very dangerous, and also evil and detestable to the Lord. God considers such acts spiritual prostitution, evil, and nothing at all to be trifled with. And Saul knew this, but in a moment of extreme desperation, allowed himself to turn to spiritists and to mediums for guidance, instead of repenting and turning to the Lord. For our purposes here, the main question we have is whether or not Saul actually spoke to the dead Samuel. To answer that, let's look at the passage, and I will offer 3 solid and biblical reasons to believe that Saul was genuinely speaking to Samuel, and that Samuel qualifies as a ghost by almost any definition of the word. Here's the pertinent parts of 1 Samuel chapter 28. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 4 through 22. The Philistines came together and camped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel, and they camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine camp, he was afraid and trembled violently. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him in dreams, or by the Urim, or by the prophets. Saul then said to his servants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I can go and consult her." His servants replied, "There is a woman at Endor, who is a medium." Saul disguised himself by putting on different clothes and set out with 2 of his men. They came to the woman at night, and Saul said, "Consult a spirit for me. Bring up for me the one I tell you." But the woman said to him, "You surely know what Saul has done, how he has killed the mediums and spiritists in this land. Why are you setting a trap for me to get me killed?" Then Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, nothing bad will happen to you because of this." "Who is it that you want me to bring up for you?" the woman asked. "Bring up Samuel for me," he answered. When the woman saw Samuel, she screamed, and then she asked Saul, "Why did you deceive me? You are Saul." But the king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" "I see a spirit form coming up out of the earth," the woman answered. Then Saul asked her, "What does he look like?" "An old man is coming up," she replied. "He's wearing a robe." Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and paid homage. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Samuel asked Saul. "I'm in serious trouble," replied Saul. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He doesn't answer me anymore, either through the prophets or in dreams. So I've called on you to tell me what I should do." Samuel answered, "Since the Lord has turned away from you and has become your enemy, why are you asking me? The Lord has done exactly what he said through me. The Lord has torn the kingship out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. You did not obey the Lord and did not carry out his burning anger against Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will also hand Israel over to the Philistines along with you. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me, and the Lord will hand Israel's army over to the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell flat on the ground. He was terrified by Samuel's words, and was also weak because he hadn't had any food all day and all night. The woman came over to Saul, and she saw that he was terrified and said to him, "Look, your servant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant. Let me set some food in front of you. Eat, and it will give you strength so you can go on your way." The prophecy of Samuel comes true exactly as it was foretold, and precisely as we would expect of the prophet of the Lord. It said, "And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord." So, does Samuel here represent a ghost? I suppose the answer depends on your precise definition of ghost. But based on most definitions, for instance, an apparition of a dead person which is believed to appear or become manifest to the living, I believe the answer is unequivocally yes. The Samuel's appearance was a demon hypothesis became more and more accepted in later church history, to the point where it eventually became the dominant view for a time. It must be reiterated, however, in the strongest possible terms, that the clearest and most obvious grammatical reading of the text seems to indicate that the spirit called up was indeed the spirit of Samuel. And, if true, that means that there is at least one genuine ghost story in the Bible. But perhaps Samuel is not the only one. In Isaiah 29, God pronounces a prophecy against his people in Jerusalem. Ah, Ariel, Ariel, the city where David encamped. Add year to year, let their feasts run their round. Yet I will distress Ariel, and there shall be moaning and lamentation, and she shall be to me like an Ariel, and I will encamp against you all around, and will besiege you with towers, and I will raise siege works against you, and you will be brought low. From the earth you shall speak, and from the dust your speech will be bowed down. Your voice shall come from the ground like the voice of a ghost, and from the dust your speech shall whisper. Isaiah chapter 29, verses 1 through 4. Now, the author is not saying that God is confirming the existence of ghosts, but he will say that it's very curious use of language. Perhaps even more curious is the intriguing incidents of Jesus, the disciples, and ghosts. More than once, when the disciples saw Jesus, they thought he was a ghost. The first time was when they were out on the sea during a storm, and he came walking across the water at night, as if to pass them. They saw him and cried out in fear, believing quite rationally that they were seeing a ghost. In Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 27, it says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After dismissing the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already over a mile from land, battered by the waves, because the wind was against them. Around 3 a.m, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and cried out in fear. Immediately Jesus spoke to them. 'Have courage, it is I, don't be afraid.' The second time was equally understandable. The disciples were huddled together in fear after the crucifixion of their master Jesus. Surely they were disheartened, broken, and terrified that they would be next to be executed. So it was their first response when Jesus suddenly appeared to them inside that locked room was not joy, but terror. Again, they thought he was a ghost. In Luke chapter 24, verses 36 through 43. And as they were saying these things, he himself stood among them. He said to them, 'Peace to you.' But they were startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. 'Why are you troubled?' he asked them. 'And why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. That is I myself. Touch me and see, because a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you can see I have.' Having said this, he showed them his hands and feet. But while they were still amazed and unbelieving because of their joy, he asked them, 'Do you have anything here to eat?' So they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence." One thing I've often quite found fascinating with this situation, given at least 2 instances for Jesus to tell the disciples that there was no such thing as ghosts, he did not do so. Instead, in Luke chapter 24, verse 39, he tells the disciples that ghosts don't have flesh and bones, unlike himself. That the disciples weren't merely seeing an image of Jesus or a phantasm or some such thing, but the real flesh and bones Jesus. Not only could they touch him, but he also ate fish right in front of them. That's the important thing in this passage, and nothing should overshadow it. but it is of more than passing interest that Jesus gave a semi-description of a ghost. Not only that, but Jesus, who often corrected the disciples when they were believing something false, declined to correct them in this instance when they thought that he was a ghost. Now, does this mean that ghosts are real? Could it possibly mean that Jesus thought ghosts were real? The answer is no, of course not. Neither of these passages tell us Jesus' opinion on ghosts. They do, however, demonstrate to us that Jesus' disciples did have some level of belief in ghosts, and that Jesus, for whatever reason, did not disabuse them of that notion. It should be noted here that there are two different words used in each of these passages that are both translated as ghosts depending on which Bible you read. In Matthew 14, the word is phantasm or phantasma, and in Luke 24, the word is spirit. The reaction of the disciples and other ancient uses of these two words seem to indicate that they both, in this kind of context, seem to mostly comport to a modern understanding of what the word ghost indicates. In concluding this discussion of ghosts in the Bible, we see that it is not a topic that the Bible shies away from, nor is it a topic that is a central focus at all. Most Christians would assume that the Bible would clearly deny the possibility of ghosts. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 through 8 says, "So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord." Hebrews chapter 9, verses 27 through 28 reads, "And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him." Philippians chapter 1, verses 21 through 24, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet, which I shall choose I cannot tell. I am hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account." They would quote passages like these that would indicate that the Bible teaches that people are instantly transported to the afterlife upon death. So that settles it, right? Or does it? Reread the above passages. Do they indicate with clarity precisely what happens after somebody dies? They certainly indicate that the ultimate destiny of the saved follower of Jesus is to be with the Lord, but there might be more to the story. Consider 1 Thessalonians, for instance. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18, it says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declared to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet with the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words." So notice how Paul uses the language of sleep in the Thessalonians passage. Often in the New Testament, Jesus, his disciples, and the apostles use the Greek word for sleep to indicate death. The hope-filled assurance of 1 Thessalonians is that those Christians who are sleeping will be awakened and raised to full life with Christ upon his return. But what about the period between the believer's death and the return of Jesus? That period is often referred to by theologians as the intermittent state. Most theologians believe that the Bible teaches that, upon death, the body of a follower of Christ and their soul are separated until the return of Jesus. The body sleeps in the earth as indicated by 1 Thessalonians, and the soul is in a heavenly place, awaiting a reuniting with the body. We have already seen in 1 Samuel chapter 28 that it was possible during Old Testament times, though likely uncommon, for a spirit to return to earth from the place of the dead. Is it possible, biblically speaking, for such a thing to happen post-resurrection of Jesus, like in the New Testament age? The answer is yes, and it has already happened at least once on a mass scale, as recorded in Matthew chapter 27, verses 52 through 53. The tombs were also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and they came out of the tombs after his resurrection, entered the holy city, and appeared to many. How is such a thing possible? The Bible never explains, but we do have both in this passage and in 1 Samuel, is the appearance on earth of people who have died and returned again. Do these instances prove that the Bible allows for the possibility of ghosts? Again, the answer is no, but it is a qualified no. I suggest that the Bible does not slam the door on the possibility of unusual events happening with people's souls during the intermittent state. Here are 3 reasons that ghosts, or something like our conception of ghosts, might be possible. Number 1, 1 Samuel 28 and Matthew 27 demonstrate that there are mechanisms available for the return of the dead to the living. Number 2, the Bible sharply warns followers of God multiple times about the dangers of necromancy and attempting to speak to the dead. If such a thing were not possible, then one wonders why the warnings are so stern. Number 3, the Bible occasionally uses language that, at least metaphorically or euphemistically, assumes the existence and possible interaction of ghosts or departed spirits. So we read here in Proverbs chapter 9, verses 10 through 18, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. For by wisdom your days will be many, and years will be added to your life. If you are wise for your own benefit. If you mock, you alone will bear the consequences. The woman folly is rowdy. She is gullible and knows nothing. She sits by the doorway of her house, on a seat at the highest point of the city, calling to those who pass by, who go straight ahead on their paths. Whoever is inexperienced, enter here. To the one who lacks sense, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten secretly is tasty. But he doesn't know that the departed spirits are there, and that her guests are in the depths of Sheol." And lastly, Isaiah chapter 19, verses 1 through 3. "An oracle against Egypt. Look, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and is coming to Egypt. Egypt's idols will tremble before him, and Egypt's heart will melt within it. I will provoke Egypt against Egypt. Each will fight against his brother, and each against his friend, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. Egypt's spirit will be disturbed within it, and I will frustrate its plans. Then they will seek idols, ghosts, spirits of the dead, and spiritists." So guys, what do you think about these instances of ghosts in the Bible? From Samuel coming back from the dead and speaking to Saul, to Jesus being recognized twice as being a ghost, and in Matthew when all of the saints came out of their tombs and went into the city, and specifically when God commands that people don't communicate with the dead or try to communicate with the dead. So what he's kind of implying is that you can communicate with the dead, it's just that he forbids it. So why is that? Why are we not allowed to talk to the dead? Why is it not accepted to believe in ghosts while also being a Christian? When clearly it implies in most passages that your body is separated from your soul. So here on earth, theoretically, you could have your ghost presence here while your soul is elsewhere. Or if you could look at it as this, as the one passage states, that when Jesus finally does return, the ones that are sleeping will be risen first, and then the ones that are living. So when Jesus comes back, is he going to bring back the ghosts first, and then come for the living? That's what it seems to imply for me. So let me know what you guys think. Comment down below. I know this is kind of a controversial topic, so be nice to each other. And remember, guys, sleep well and have a happy Easter.